The word hit Theresa Lawson like a bullet she never saw coming. Foreclosure. She stood in the middle of the main street of Caldwell County, Kansas, on a brittle October morning in 1882, the paper trembling in her gloved hands, her dark eyes scanning the legal language with a mounting horror she refused to let show on her face. Around her, the town was stirring to its early morning rhythms. The blacksmith's hammer rang out 2 streets over. A rooster called from somewhere behind the saloon. The smell of bread from the bakery drifted down the road, warm and mocking in its ordinary comfort. Ordinary, that was the word. Everything around her was ordinary, going on as if the ground beneath her feet had not just cracked open. The paper declared that Lawson Ranch, 160 acres of some of the finest grassland in all of southern Kansas, would be seized by the Caldwell County Land and Trust Company effective the first day of November, 1882, unless the outstanding debt of $2,340 was paid in full. Signed by one Harlan Voss, president of said company, and notarized, and absolutely, devastatingly legal. Theresa folded the paper with the careful precision of a woman who was holding herself together through sheer force of will. She tucked it into the pocket of her riding coat, lifted her chin, and looked down the length of the street toward the sheriff's office, a low adobe building with a single window and a wooden sign that swung in the October wind. She had come to town for salt and flour and maybe a new length of ribbon for her niece. She had not come to town to lose her father's land. She had 3 weeks. What happened over those next 3 weeks would later be called, by the people of Caldwell County who witnessed it, one of the most remarkable sequences of events they had ever seen unfold in their small corner of the frontier. But for Theresa Lawson, standing alone on that dusty street with the foreclosure notice pressing against her ribs like a second heartbeat, it began with a single decision. She was not leaving, not that morning, not that November, not ever. But she had no idea, not yet, that the man who would stand beside her in that conviction was currently sitting in the sheriff's office with his boots on his desk, drinking coffee gone cold, and reading last week's edition of the Caldwell County Courier, with the relaxed authority of a man who had absolutely no idea that his life was about to be permanently rearranged. Clark Shepard had been the sheriff of Caldwell County for 4 years. He was 31 years old, built lean and hard in the way of men who spent their lives on horseback and on their feet. His hair was the color of dark wheat, his eyes a steady, patient gray that people in town had come to associate with fairness. He was not a man who raised his voice. He was not a man who needed to. There was a quality about him, something in the way he moved through a room or stood in a doorway, that communicated a kind of quiet authority most men spent their whole lives trying to fake. He had come to Caldwell County from Missouri, carrying a past he did not discuss in detail and a reputation that had preceded him. He had served as a deputy marshal in 2 different territories. He had tracked men through blizzards and arroyos and stood down more than one situation that should have ended in blood but somehow, because of something in those gray eyes, had not. The people of Caldwell County had hired him because they needed order, and Clark Shepard had given them order, and in 4 years he had earned something considerably harder to earn than respect. He had earned trust. He heard the office door open and set down his coffee. Theresa Lawson stepped through it, and Clark Shepard, for the first and only time anyone in Caldwell County had ever witnessed, sat up straight so fast he nearly knocked his boots off his desk. He recovered. He was good at recovering. "Miss Lawson," he said, standing in the way men of his generation did when a woman entered a room, "what can I do for you?" Theresa pulled the foreclosure notice from her coat and placed it on his desk with a precision that suggested she had decided exactly how she was going to present this problem and was not going to let herself veer from that plan. "You can tell me," she said, "whether this is legal." Clark took the paper. He read it. He read it again. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Where did you receive this?" he asked. "It was delivered to my door yesterday evening by one of Harlan Voss's men, a fellow named Cleet who I believe you know." Clark set the paper down. Cleet Dunbar. That is what he said his name was, yes. Clark looked at her. He had seen Theresa Lawson before, obviously. Caldwell County was not a large place. He knew she had inherited the Lawson ranch from her father, Marcus Lawson, who had died of a fever the previous winter. He knew she had been running the ranch with her older brother for 6 months before her brother had taken a job on the railroad and moved his family north to Abilene. He knew she had stayed. He knew she was stubborn about it in a way that the town largely admired even while it openly doubted. He had not previously known, or perhaps had not previously let himself notice, the precise quality of her dark eyes or the way she held herself in the face of catastrophe as if her spine had been forged rather than grown. He noticed now. Technically, he said carefully, as written, this document is legal. You took out a loan from Caldwell County Land and Trust 3 years ago to purchase the additional 80 acres on the eastern edge of the property. Your father signed it. I know what my father signed. And the debt has not been paid. The debt was being paid, Theresa said, every quarter, regular as the seasons, until Harlan Voss decided 6 months ago that the quarterly rate of repayment was insufficient and increased the interest retroactively, which he had no right to do. Clark was quiet for a moment. You have documentation of this. I have every receipt my father and I ever sent. I have the original loan agreement. I have the letter from Voss changing the terms unilaterally. And I have, she said, reaching into her other coat pocket and withdrawing a second folded paper, a letter from a lawyer in Wichita who says the retroactive change in terms is almost certainly not enforceable under Kansas territorial statute. Almost certainly was doing considerable work in that sentence, and both of them knew it. Clark picked up the lawyer's letter and read it carefully. Then he set it down beside the foreclosure notice and looked at Theresa Lawson with those steady gray eyes for a long moment. Harlan Voss, he said, has been acquiring land in this county for 3 years. He has done it quietly, through exactly these kinds of maneuvers. Loans called in early, terms changed, debts inflated. You are not the first person to come through that door with a paper like this one. You are, however, the first one who has come in with a lawyer's letter and a full set of receipts. Something shifted in Theresa's expression, just slightly. The rigid control she had walked in wearing softened by precisely 1 degree. Are you telling me I have a case? I am telling you, Clark said, that what Voss is doing is wrong, and I believe it may be illegal, and that what you have brought me is more ammunition than I have had before. He paused. I am also telling you that Voss is powerful, that he has money and connections, and that this will not be easy. I know it will not be easy, Theresa said. Easy would have meant leaving. Clark looked at her for another moment. Something in the back of his chest did something he chose for the time being to ignore. Then we should talk, he said, about what we are going to do. Those 3 words, we should talk, were the beginning of everything. Theresa had grown up on the Lawson Ranch. She had been born on that land in 1857, the second child of Marcus and Eleanor Lawson, who had come out from Kentucky in a covered wagon with $20, a milk cow, and a set of cast iron pots that Theresa still used. Eleanor had died when Theresa was 12, of a difficult second pregnancy that took both mother and infant in a single brutal December night. Marcus had never fully recovered from that grief, but he had kept the ranch going with the quiet, stubborn dedication of a man who understood that the land was the only legacy he could leave his children. Theresa's brother Daniel had always been meant to inherit, but Daniel had his own restlessness, his own dreams of something beyond the flat horizon of Kansas. When Marcus died, Daniel had stayed only long enough to make sure the cattle were properly managed and the roof of the main house was repaired before accepting the railroad position and moving his wife and 3 children north. He had asked Theresa to come. She had refused. He had not, to his credit, pushed very hard, because he knew her well enough to understand that asking Theresa Lawson to leave her father's land was roughly equivalent to asking the land itself to get up and walk away. She was 25 years old. She had managed the ranch for 6 months alone, with 2 hired hands named Pete Acre and Jimmy Calloway, both of whom were loyal and capable and genuinely fond of her. She had kept the cattle healthy, negotiated a fair price with the beef buyer from Wichita, and replanted the kitchen garden her mother had started 20 years before. She had done everything right. Harlan Voss had done everything wrong, and he had done it deliberately. And Theresa had spent 6 months watching it happen before she had received the foreclosure notice that made it impossible to ignore any longer. Harlan Voss was 48 years old, a man who had come to Caldwell County 5 years prior with a briefcase full of money and a vision for what he called progress. He had bought the newspaper and the Caldwell County Land and Trust Company within a year of arriving. He had built himself a large house on the northern edge of town, hired a cook and 2 housemaids, and begun attending every town council meeting with the air of a man who had not yet decided whether to buy the council or simply replace it. His ambition was not a secret. What was less obvious was the specific shape of it. Caldwell County sat along the Kisham Trail, which was slowly dying as the railroads pushed further west, but the land itself, particularly the grassland along the creek beds and the rich bottomland of the Lawson property's eastern acres, was valuable in ways that outlasted cattle drives. Voss had a deal in the works with a land development company out of Chicago that wanted to purchase a consolidated block of land for agricultural development on a commercial scale. He needed the land. He had been acquiring it piecemeal for 3 years, through legal means, and through means that were legal in their paperwork but not in their spirit. He had not anticipated Theresa Lawson refusing to be dispossessed quietly, and he had not anticipated Clark Shepard deciding to do something about it. Clark spent the 3 days after Theresa's first visit to his office doing something he was genuinely excellent at, which was quietly gathering information without drawing attention to himself. He talked to the county clerk, a small, precise woman named Agnes Hewitt, who had been recording deeds and mortgages in Caldwell County for 11 years, and who had very definite opinions, expressed in very careful language, about some of the recent filings she had processed. He talked to 2 other ranchers who had lost land to Voss's trust company, a man named Roy Alderman, whose family had owned their homestead for 8 years before the debt on their barn expansion had been used to push them off, and an older widow named Mrs. Dolers Crane, who had sold under pressure, but who had kept a careful diary of every conversation she had been party to during the process. He talked to the lawyer in Wichita by telegraph, a man named Sterling Gates, who confirmed that the retroactive interest change in the Lawson loan was, in his considered opinion, a violation of the terms of the original agreement and likely unenforceable in a Kansas court. He talked with more difficulty to a man named Frank Pruitt, who worked as a clerk in Voss's land trust office and who had a conscience that had been eating at him for 2 years. On the 4th day, Clark rode out to the Lawson ranch. He had told himself that this was entirely professional. He told himself this for the entirety of the 11-mile ride and did not entirely convince himself, but he had a great deal of practice at maintaining useful fictions when necessary. So he arrived at the ranch house looking composed and purposeful rather than like a man who had thought about a pair of dark eyes approximately 17 times in the past 4 days. The ranch house was modest but well-kept whitewashed adobe with a porch across the front and a kitchen garden wrapped around the south side. There was a barn and a smaller outbuilding, a corral with 6 horses, and in the near pasture a herd of perhaps 40 head of cattle. 2 men were working near the barn, and one of them lifted a hand in greeting as Clark dismounted and tied his horse at the post. Theresa came out onto the porch before he had finished tying the knot. She had clearly been working, because she was wearing a canvas apron over a plain dark dress, and she had flour on her hands, which she was wiping on the apron as she came through the door. Her dark hair was pinned up but coming loose on one side in the way of hair that has been worn through a busy morning. She stopped on the top step and looked at him with those serious, watchful eyes. "Sheriff Shepard," she said. "I said we should talk," he said. "I've been gathering some things you should know about." She studied him for a moment. Then she stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside, then. I have coffee." The inside of the house was as orderly and sparse as the outside. A good kitchen with a heavy iron stove, a round table with 4 chairs, a sitting room beyond with a horsehair sofa, and a reading chair and bookshelves that held perhaps 40 books, which was more books than Clark had seen in any private home in Caldwell County. There was a writing desk by the window with papers on it, and a glass inkwell, and a pen laid precisely beside it. He sat down at the kitchen table and she set coffee in front of him, the kind of strong dark coffee that suggested she had been up since before dawn and expected to need the fuel. He spread out on the table what he had collected: the telegraph from Sterling Gates, his notes from the county clerk, Roy Alderman's account, written out in Clark's own hand because Roy could not write easily, Mrs. Crane's diary entries which she had agreed to lend him, and a document from Frank Prout that was, Clark said carefully, the most significant piece of the puzzle. Theresa read everything. She read it with complete attention, turning pages, going back to reread sections, asking 2 sharp, precise questions that told Clark she had a faster mind than most people in Caldwell County had likely given her credit for. When she finished, she set the last page down and looked at him. "Prout is willing to testify?" she asked. "With some protection, yes. He says Voss has falsified at least 6 loan records over the past 2 years, changed payment dates, invented missed payments, altered the terms retroactively in multiple cases. Yours is not unique. Yours is just the one where you kept the receipts." Theresa's jaw was tight. "And Alderman, Mrs. Crane. They lost their land. There is no legal mechanism right now to recover it without a proper civil proceeding, and that would take time and money neither of them has. But they can testify to the pattern, to the method." Theresa was quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse moved in the corral. A wind came through the kitchen window carrying the smell of dry grass and the faint sweetness of late fall. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "I am proposing," Clark said, "that we take this to the county judge. Judge Elias Hooper has been on the bench here for 12 years. He is an honest man. He does not like Harlan Voss, but more to the point, he does not like fraud, and what Voss has been doing is fraud." He paused. "I want to file an injunction to halt the foreclosure proceedings until the court can review the loan documents and the testimony. If Hooper grants it, Voss cannot move on your property until the matter is resolved. And if Hooper does not grant it." Clark met her eyes steadily. "Then we find another way." It was not the most reassuring answer she had ever received, but there was something in the matter-of-fact quality of it that she found, unexpectedly, more comforting than reassurance. He was not promising her things he did not know were true. He was not managing her. He was thinking alongside her, treating her as an equal party to the problem, and that was something so uncommon in her experience that it landed with unexpected weight. "All right," she said, "what do you need from me?" What he needed from her was the original loan agreement, all of the payment receipts, her letter from Sterling Gates, and a written account in her own hand of every interaction she had had with Voss or his representatives since her father's death. She produced all of these over the course of the next hour, with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been quietly preparing for exactly this possibility, and had simply been waiting for someone to help her execute it. Clark rode back to town that evening with a saddlebag full of documents and a mind that was working hard on the practical mechanics of the legal strategy, while another part of it, a quieter and more dangerous part, kept noting things it had no business noting. The way she had said "all right" as if it were a declaration rather than an agreement. The 40 books on the shelf. The flower still on her hands when she sat down at the table and never noticed it. The total absence of any performance of distress, any bid for sympathy, any impulse to soften the problem or make herself seem less capable of handling it. He had met a great number of people in his years as a lawman. He had dealt with fear and courage and desperation and cunning in 100 combinations. He had not previously encountered this precise quality, this compound of clear-eyed toughness and complete absence of pretension, and he found it, in a way he could not have easily articulated, extraordinary. He filed the injunction petition with the county court the following morning. Harlan Voss heard about it by noon. Voss was a tall man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with pale eyes set beneath heavy brows, and a way of keeping his face very still when he was angry that was more unsettling than the alternative would have been. He ran his hand and trust business from an office above the mercantile, a well-appointed space with a large mahogany desk and framed certificates on the walls and a window that looked down onto Main Street, which gave him the perpetual advantage of being able to watch the town without being easily observed. He had expected the foreclosure on the Lawson property to proceed without incident. He had made a systematic study of Theresa Lawson's position and had concluded that a single woman with no local family, limited financial resources, and a piece of land she could not defend legally was an easy acquisition. He had moved on 7 properties with that calculation and been right every time. He had not factored in Clark Shepard. The relationship between Voss and Shepard had been formally cordial and practically cool from the beginning. Voss had attempted, in his first year in Caldwell County, to make Clark an ally through a series of increasingly specific kindnesses, a new saddle, a standing invitation to dinner, a suggestion that there might be opportunities in the land trust for a man of Clark's capabilities. Clark had accepted nothing and declined everything without making an enemy of it, which was a social tightrope that Voss had come to understand. The sheriff walked with irritating ease. Now Voss sat behind his mahogany desk and looked at his lawyer, a man named Percy Gill who had come out from Topeka and who was shrewd in the specific, narrow way of men who had spent too long working for people who were not interested in being told no. "Can the injunction succeed?" Voss asked. Gill considered. "If Hooper grants it, and there is a reasonable chance he will since the grounds are valid, the foreclosure is halted pending full court review. If the woman's documents are as complete as Shepard apparently believes they are, a review could find against us on the retroactive interest change. How long would a review take? 6 months, perhaps 8. And the Chicago deal?" Gill said nothing, because he knew Voss knew the answer. The Chicago Land Development Company had given Voss until spring to deliver a consolidated block of land that included the Lawson Eastern Acres. Without it, the deal collapsed, a deal worth more money than Caldwell County generated in a decade. Voss stood up and went to the window. He looked down at Main Street. He could see at the far end the sheriff's office, its wooden sign turning slowly in the October wind. "I want to know," Voss said quietly, "what Shepard cares about. Everyone cares about something. Find out what it is." What Clark Shepard cared about, in the professional sense, was justice, which was unfortunately not a leverage point. What Clark Shepard cared about, in the personal sense, was beginning to involve Theresa Lawson in ways that were complicating his ability to maintain the clean objectivity he usually brought to his work, and Voss would not find that out for some time. Judge Elias Hooper was a man of 62 who wore his white hair long and his reading glasses on a chain, and had a face carved into angular dignity by a lifetime of weighing other people's truths against each other. He had come to Kansas from Virginia before the war, had kept his court through occupation and Reconstruction and the peculiar lawlessness of the cattle drive years, and had developed, in consequence, a profound resistance to pressure of any kind. He read the injunction petition in his chambers on a Thursday morning, and he read it for a long time, and when he was done he looked up at Clark over the reading glasses and said, "This is substantial, Sheriff." "It is," Clark agreed. "Voss will fight it." "He will," Clark agreed again. Hooper set down the petition. "You have a witness who worked inside Voss's operation, Frank Pruitt." He kept his own records separate from the official books as a kind of insurance. He has documentation of alterations made to loan files." Hooper was quiet for a moment. "The woman, the Lawson woman, she knows what she is getting into. She was the one who came to me," Clark said. "She has been preparing for this longer than I have." Hooper almost smiled. He had known Marcus Lawson, had respected him. "He was a hard man to move off a fixed position," he said, which was not directly about Theresa but clearly was. He picked up his pen. "I am going to grant the injunction. The foreclosure proceedings are stayed pending full review of the original loan documentation, the payment records, and the testimony of any relevant parties. The court date will be set for the 20th of November, 20 days away, just inside the original foreclosure deadline." Clark walked out of Hooper's chambers and into the cold morning air and stood on the courthouse steps for a moment with something that was not quite relief, because relief implied that the hard part was over, and he knew with absolute certainty that it was not. He was right. The first indication that Voss was escalating came 3 days later, when Pete Acre, one of Theresa's 2 hired hands, came into town with a split lip and a badly bruised eye. He had been returning to the ranch from the feed store when 2 men had stopped him on the road and suggested, in a physical and explicit way, that working for Theresa Lawson was going to become an increasingly unhealthy occupation. Pete Acre was 32 years old, the son of a freedman who had come west from Georgia after the war, and he had been working at the Lawson Ranch since Marcus was alive. He sat across from Clark's desk with his hat in his hands and his injured eye beginning to swell shut, and said, with a calm that Clark recognized as the specific hard-won calm of a man who had faced worse than this and survived it, "I'm not leaving, Sheriff. I just want it on the record." "It is on the record," Clark said, "and I want names." Pete gave him names. Clark recognized both of them, men who did occasional work around Voss's operation. He went to find them, had brief, pointed conversations with each, and made very clear that any further intimidation of ranch hands employed by citizens of Caldwell County would result in immediate arrest and charges. He said this calmly, without raised voice, standing slightly closer than was strictly comfortable, in the way that tended to make people believe he meant exactly what he was saying. Both men left Caldwell County within 2 days. Voss would need to find new tools. Clark rode out to the Lawson Ranch the next morning to tell Theresa what had happened. He found her in the corral with a young sorrel horse she was working to break to saddle, which she was doing with a patient, methodical competence that reminded him immediately of the very specific quality he had been trying not to think about. She saw him coming and brought the horse to the rail and climbed through the fence boards with the economical ease of long practice. She listened to what he told her. Her expression went tight and controlled at the part about Pete, but she did not cry, which he had not expected her to, and she did not panic, which he had not expected either. "He will try something else," she said. "Yes." "What?" "If I were Voss," Clark said, "I would try to get to Frank Prout. Without Prout's testimony, what we have is compelling but less definitive. Prout is the direct evidence of document alteration. The rest is a paper trail that Voss's lawyer can argue is a matter of disputed interpretation." Theresa looked at him. "Then we need to protect Frank Prout. I have a plan for that, but I also want to talk about you." She raised an eyebrow, which he was beginning to understand was her version of a full page of expressive reaction compressed into a single gesture. "Your safety," he clarified with slightly more haste than he intended. She considered this. "Pete and Jimmy are both here. The cattle have to be managed. I cannot simply lock myself in the house for 3 weeks. I know that. What I am suggesting is that you not ride out alone onto the range land for the time being, that you take a firearm whenever you leave the house perimeter, and that if anything unusual happens, any person you do not know, any interaction that feels wrong, you send word to me immediately." He paused, then added, because it was accurate and because he had decided some hours ago that accuracy was the safest policy with this particular woman, "I am also going to be riding out here more often than strictly necessary. If that is acceptable." There was a small silence. The sorrel horse moved in the corral behind her, and a meadowlark called from the fence line with the clear, indifferent beauty of a bird that had no interest in the complicated negotiations of human beings. "That," Theresa said, "is acceptable." He rode back to town with the meadowlark's call following him for half a mile. The thing about Theresa Lawson that Clark was beginning to understand was that she was not simply brave or simply determined. She was lonely. It was visible in the 40 books on the shelf, in the writing desk that had clearly seen hours of use, in the precise, well-tended kitchen garden she maintained entirely for herself, because she had long since passed the point where solitary determination had filled the space that company would have occupied. She had been alone on this land for 6 months, and before that she had been effectively alone in a deeper sense, tending to a father whose grief had quieted him and a brother whose direction had always been away. She was not a woman who complained about this. She had so thoroughly accommodated herself to her own company that the loneliness was a thing she carried without fuss, the way you carry a stone in your boot once you have decided you do not have time to stop and remove it. Clark saw it because he recognized it. He had his own version of it, quieter and more armored, the product of years moving from one posting to another, building enough connection in each place to do his job well, but never quite enough to make leaving difficult. He had not let himself examine the question of why he was still in Caldwell County 4 years later, which was longer than any previous posting, by a considerable margin. The second week before the court date, Clark found reasons to be at the Lawson Ranch every other day. He told himself these were legitimate visits, and they were, in the sense that there was always something to report or discuss or check on. Voss had made 2 additional moves. First, an attempt to persuade Agnes Hewitt at the county clerk's office to misfile some of Theresa's original documents, which Agnes had refused with a stiff-backed dignity that Clark found deeply satisfying when she told him about it. And second, a formal counterpetition to Judge Hooper claiming that the injunction was improper on procedural grounds, which Hooper dismissed in 45 minutes. But the legitimate reasons for the visits were not the only reasons, and after the 4th visit, Clark stopped pretending otherwise to himself, which was a thing he rarely did with himself. He was going out there because he wanted to, because something in him had decided, with the quiet certainty of those gray eyes that were not in the habit of lying even to their owner, that the Lawson Ranch and its stubbornly present occupant had become the most interesting and necessary fixture in his daily horizon. He helped her mend a section of fence on the western pasture one afternoon, working alongside Pete and Jimmy in the specific, companionable silence of shared physical labor. He talked with her in the evenings on the porch, as the sun went enormous and orange over the flat Kansas plain, about things that had nothing to do with the court case, about the books she had read, about Missouri, which she had asked him about with a directness that suggested she had decided he was someone worth knowing about the way the land changed in each season, which she described with an intimacy and precision that made clear she had been paying attention to every square foot of it her entire life. He told her things he did not generally tell people, about his parents, who had been good people reduced by circumstance to hard ones, about his early years as a deputy in Missouri, which had been sometimes ugly and always instructive, about the particular loneliness of a lawman's life, which he framed in careful, measured language that did not quite hide, from someone paying close attention, how deep it ran. Theresa paid close attention. She was 25 and he was 31, and neither of them was particularly inclined to rush at things, which was fortunate because the situation they were in did not leave much room for rushing. But the accumulation of evenings on the porch and shared work, and the specific quality of the silence between them when conversation paused, was doing its own patient, inevitable work. One evening, 10 days before the court date, she showed him her mother's cast iron pots. She said this without any particular ceremony, just brought him into the kitchen to look at something she was stirring for supper and gestured at them on the shelf, telling him they had come from Kentucky in a covered wagon. Her mother had cooked in them for 20 years before she died. Theresa had cooked in them for 13 years since. Clark looked at the pots and then at Theresa, and she was looking at him with an expression that was not quite open and not quite closed, something balanced between them, and he understood that she was telling him something about what this land meant, not just in acres and debts and legal documents, but in the weight of continuity, the accumulated physical reality of a life built in a specific place over generations. "We are going to keep them here," he said. She did not say anything, but she looked at him in a way that he carried back to town and kept in the front of his mind for the remaining 10 days. Frank Pruitt was being kept at a boarding house in a small settlement 8 miles east of Caldwell, under a name that was not his own, with Clark checking on him by messenger every second day. Pruitt was nervous but holding. He had a wife and 2 children in town, and Clark had arranged for them to stay with a family he trusted while the situation resolved. It was not a perfect arrangement, but it was the best available, and Pruitt understood that his testimony on the 20th of November was the keystone of the entire case. On the 15th of November, 5 days before the court date, Voss made his biggest move. Clark found out about it through Agnes Hewitt, who arrived at his office at 7 in the morning in a state of controlled agitation that would have alarmed him if she had not been the kind of woman who was constitutionally incapable of full alarm. It was more that her normal precision had been ratcheted up to something approaching vibration. She placed a document on his desk. "This was filed this morning through the Wichita Circuit Court," she said. "It is a claim that the original Lawson homestead grant, the first 80 acres, the land that was deeded to Marcus Lawson in 1862, was improperly recorded under Kansas homestead law due to a boundary discrepancy with an adjacent military reservation survey. The claim argues that the original deed is void." Clark picked up the document. He read it once. He set it down. "If the original deed is void," he said, "then there is no underlying property," Agnes said. "The additional 80 acres secured by the loan are irrelevant because there is nothing for them to be attached to. Voss acquires the entire 160 acres, not through foreclosure but through a claim of void title." It was elegant in the way that deeply unethical things sometimes are, and it was designed to be too complicated to fight in 5 days. Clark sat with it for 3 minutes, thinking hard. Then he picked up his hat and said, "Agnes, is there a plat map of the original 1862 survey?" "There is," she said, "in the archive. I need it." "I already pulled it," Agnes said, and produced it from the folder she was carrying. Clark looked at her. "You have been running ahead of this problem." "Someone has to," Agnes said, with a precision that was as close to warmth as she generally got. She pointed at the plat map. The military reservation boundary marker in the 1861 survey was moved in 1866 as part of a general survey correction by the Federal Land Office. The Lawson homestead was never inside the reservation. There is a correction filing in the Federal Land Office records in Topeka. Clark stared at her. "How do you know this?" Agnes looked at him steadily. "Because I have been the county clerk for 11 years, and I have read every survey, deed, and filing in this county's records, including the ones Voss probably hoped no one had read." She paused. "I have a telegraph copy of the federal correction filing on its way from Topeka today. It should arrive by this afternoon." Clark stood up. He had the strong impulse to do something dramatic to express his appreciation and settled instead for saying with considerable sincerity, "Agnes, you are extraordinary." Agnes straightened her collar. "I am doing my job," she said. "Go tell that woman what is happening." Clark rode to the Lawson ranch faster than he had yet ridden it. Theresa was in the kitchen when he arrived. She came out onto the porch when she heard the horse and looked at his face and said, "What happened?" He told her. All of it, including the solution. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Behind her, through the kitchen window, Clark could hear something on the stove, something with rosemary in it, and the homely normalcy of that smell while they stood in the potential ruins of everything she owned was so specifically difficult that he made himself focus on the practical. "The telegraph from Topeka," she said. "You are certain Agnes will have it today?" "Agnes Hewitt has never told me something she was not certain of," Clark said. "In 4 years, not once." Theresa looked out across her land. The cattle were moving in the south pasture. Pete was visible near the barn, doing something with a length of rope. The sky was a particular shade of cold blue that November in Kansas did its best work in. Everything on those 160 acres was hers, born from her family's decades of labor and love and grief, and it was also, right now, hanging by exactly the kind of thread that could snap. "Clark," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. He was fairly certain she knew exactly what she was doing when she used it, because she was not a person who did things accidentally. He looked at her. "I want to tell you something," she said. She was still looking at the land, not at him. "When I got that foreclosure notice, when I was standing in the street reading it, I thought for about 30 seconds about leaving, about going to Abilene to Daniel's family, starting over somewhere else." She paused. "And then I walked into your office." He waited. "I am not telling you that to say the last 2 weeks have been easy. They have not been. I have been frightened and I have been angry, and there have been nights when I have been more alone in this house than I have ever been in my life." She turned and looked at him then, and the quality of her regard was perfectly direct in the way of someone who has decided that honesty is the only currency worth spending. "But I am also telling you that I have not thought about leaving again. Not since that first morning, and that has something to do with the case and with Judge Hooper and with Agnes and her files, and it has something to do with you, and I think you know that." Clark was quiet for one full, weighted moment. "I know that," he said. The meadowlark called again from somewhere in the field, and neither of them moved for a long time, standing on the porch of her mother's house, surrounded by her father's land, with the cold November sun holding them in its flat, indifferent, improbably beautiful light. He did not stay that evening. He had things to do in town that were genuinely urgent: the Topeka telegraph to collect, a conversation to have with Sterling Gates by wire, a final check on Frank Prout. But when he left, he held her hand briefly on the porch step, the first time either of them had touched the other deliberately, and the warmth of it stayed in his palm all the way back to town. The Topeka telegraph arrived at 4 in the afternoon, exactly as Agnes had predicted. It contained a certified copy of the 1866 Federal Survey correction, which conclusively established that the Lawson homestead had never intersected with the military reservation boundary. Clark sat with it and Agnes and Sterling Gates, communicating by wire, for 2 hours and assembled a response to Voss's Wichita filing that Gates agreed to transmit directly to the circuit court first thing the following morning. That was November 15th. They had 5 days. On the 16th, Voss made his last play. Clark was in the office when the boy came with the note. It was written on Voss's personal stationery, a heavy cream paper embossed with the initials HV, and it said, in the direct language of a man who had decided that the indirect approach was proving insufficient, that Clark should come to Voss's office for a private conversation at his earliest convenience. The note was polite and the phrasing was not threatening, and there was nothing in it, technically, that was anything other than an invitation. Clark went, because not going would have been a kind of weakness, and because he wanted to know what Voss had to say. Voss's office was as imposing as it was meant to be. Clark sat in the offered chair and took no offered refreshment and looked at Voss across the mahogany desk with the expression he used when he was gathering information rather than expressing anything. Voss began obliquely and moved toward his point with the patience of a man who was used to eventually arriving at it. He spoke about the county's development, about progress, about the difficulty of building something new in a place that was sometimes resistant to change. He spoke about the land development deal with Chicago, the jobs it would bring, the money that would flow into Caldwell County commerce. He was, in short, making his best case for the proposition that what was good for Harlan Voss was good for Caldwell County. Then he paused and looked at Clark with those pale eyes and said, "You have made an enemy in me, Sheriff, and you should understand that. But it is not irreversible. There are other pieces of land that can be assembled. The Lawson property is important but not essential. If the woman is willing to sell at a fair price, I have no quarrel with her, and you and I need not be adversaries." "You could have offered a fair price 2 years ago," Clark said. "I could have," Voss acknowledged without visible regret. "I did not. I am doing so now." "And the pressure on Pete Acre, the void title filing, the attempts to intimidate your former clerk into silence." Voss said nothing. "There is something you have not considered," Clark said. He stood up. "You have been operating in this county under the assumption that the people here are isolated, individual, unconnected. You can move on one family at a time because no single person can stand against what you have assembled. You have been right about that until recently." He picked up his hat. "But the court date is the 20th, 5 days, and what you are going to discover on the 20th is what happens when the people of this county stop being isolated." He left the office. He walked down the stairs and out onto Main Street and stood for a moment in the cold November wind. Then he went to work. What Clark did in the next 4 days was something that would later be described as bold, which was the right word, but it was also something more specific. It was a decision to use the authority he had spent 4 years building, not in the way of force but in the way of trust, the kind of trust that is the real foundation of every lasting institution, and that is much harder to earn than the right to carry a badge. He talked to Roy Alderman and to Dolores Crane, not just as witnesses, but as people who had been wronged and who had a right to see it addressed. He talked to Pete Acre and to Jimmy Calloway, who had both stayed at the Lawson Ranch in spite of the intimidation, and he told them directly that their courage was part of what was making justice possible. He talked to the other families in the county who had been touched by Voss's operations and who had been individually too small and too frightened to speak, and he told them that the court date on the 20th was public and invited. He talked to the editor of the Caldwell County Courier, a man named Thomas Reed who had been careful not to write anything that might antagonize Voss, who owned the paper's main competitor in Wichita. Clark did not ask Reed to write anything. He simply laid out the facts and said that Reed could do with them as his conscience directed. The issue of the Courier that appeared on November 18th carried, on its front page, a long and detailed account of the Voss Land Trust's operations in Caldwell County, including the specific mechanisms of loan fraud and document alteration, based on documentary evidence currently before the court. It named Harlan Voss. It named the Chicago Land Development Company. It named every property that had been acquired through the fraudulent process. Caldwell County read it over their breakfast tables on a cold November morning, and the anger was quiet and thorough in the way of people who have been patiently absorbing something wrong for a long time and have just been given permission to acknowledge it. Clark rode to the Lawson Ranch on the evening of the 18th. He had told himself he was going to report on the Courier article and on Frank Pruitt's status and on the circuit court's dismissal of the void title filing, which had come through that afternoon. All of those things were true, and all of them were actually reported. But he also sat on the porch with her in the cold, with the sky going black and enormous and brilliant above the plains in the way it only does when the air is clear and dry, and there is nothing between you and the stars but the enormous indifferent arc of the sky, and they talked for a long time about things that were not the case. She told him about a book she had been reading, a novel that had come up from Wichita in a parcel she ordered every 4 months from a bookseller there. It was by George Eliot, a woman who published under a man's name, and Theresa described the specific quality of the main character's situation, a woman who had to choose between what was expected of her and what she actually wanted, with an intensity that was not quite ostensibly about herself and very clearly was. Clark listened with his full attention, which was the kind of listening that people sense and that creates its own particular intimacy. She chooses wrong at first, Theresa said. The character. She chooses what is expected, and then she has to live with it for a very long time before she gets a chance to choose again. Do you think she is right to wait that long? Clark asked. Theresa turned and looked at him. They were sitting close together on the porch bench, the cold having drawn them slightly inward without either of them explicitly acknowledging it. In the darkness, the details of his face were simplified, the steady quality of his attention undiluted. I think, she said, that the book admires her patience more than I do. He smiled, which she had learned was something he did rarely and entirely genuinely, and which, in consequence, had an effect that was probably disproportionate to its physical reality. Is that so? I am not a particularly patient person, she said, about most things. You have been managing this ranch alone for 6 months and fighting a complicated legal battle with your receipts and your lawyer's letters and your absolute refusal to be moved, he said. You seem patient to me. That is not patience, she said. That is obstinacy. They look similar from the outside. He looked at her for a long moment. The stars were very bright. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, and the sound of it was both lonely and not, the signature sound of this specific landscape that she had heard her entire life, and that was, she realized, as intimately hers as anything she owned. Theresa, he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. She noticed this with a precision that matched exactly the precision with which she had used his. I want to tell you something, he said. After the 20th, after whatever happens in that courtroom, whatever the outcome, I would like to continue talking to you. It was not a declaration. It was not a proposal of any kind. It was something more particular, a request, phrased carefully by a man who was in the habit of saying things he meant and meaning only what he said, that she should know he intended to remain in her world beyond the immediate necessity that had placed him there. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You have been riding out here every other day for 2 weeks. Yes, and talking to me on the porch until dark. Yes, and helping me mend fence. That is also true. Then, she said, with the particular dry composure that he was coming to love like a specific weather system that only existed in one place on Earth, I think we have already established that you intend to continue talking to me. He laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, the kind that came from being caught out by someone who was entirely right, and she turned to look at him when she heard it because it was a sound she had not heard from him before, and it was, she discovered, one she wanted to hear again. I suppose we have, he said. They were still sitting close together on the cold porch, and when the conversation found one of its natural pauses, neither of them moved to increase the distance, and the specific quality of that shared stillness was not nothing. It was, in fact, the quiet beginning of something that both of them could feel, and that neither of them was in a hurry to name, because named things become defined, and defined things have edges, and this, whatever it was something they were both instinctively reluctant to trim. The 20th of November arrived on a clear, cold morning that felt, to Theresa, like something out of a dream you try to hold onto as you wake. She dressed carefully. She wore her best dress, a deep blue wool with a high collar that her sister-in-law had sent from Abilene the previous Christmas, and that she had not yet had occasion to wear, and her good boots, and a coat that had been her mother's, a dark wool-fitted coat with black buttons that was perhaps slightly old-fashioned but was warm and was hers, and she put it on with a decisiveness that was its own kind of armor. Pete and Jimmy drove her to town in the wagon. Clark met them at the edge of Main Street, already there and watching, and the look he gave her when she climbed down from the wagon was something she filed carefully away to examine later. A long, steady look that said several things, including, most simply, that she was not standing here alone. The courthouse was the largest building in Caldwell County, a 2-story stone building that had been built with the specific ambition of people who intended to stay. The courtroom on the second floor had a gallery with wooden benches that seated perhaps 60 people. By 9 in the morning, those benches were full. Theresa sat at the plaintiff's table. Sterling Gates had come up from Wichita the previous evening and was beside her, a composed man of 50 with a silver beard who had clearly read every document in the case and who radiated the specific confidence of someone who has prepared completely for something important. Clark sat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind her, and she was aware of this the way you are aware of something warm in a cold room. Harlan Voss sat at the opposite table. Percy Gill was beside him. Voss's face was very still. Judge Hooper entered and the room settled. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Sterling Gates presented the original loan agreement. He presented Theresa's complete payment records. He presented the letter in which Voss had unilaterally changed the loan terms, and he presented Kansas Territorial Statute 42, Section 7, which was very clear about the conditions under which loan terms could be altered and the conditions under which they could not. He presented the Federal Survey correction from Topeka, which disposed of the void title claim cleanly and permanently. He presented Frank Prout. Frank Prout was small and nervous and looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had decided, regardless of the cost, to put it down. He testified for 40 minutes. He described, in specific and documented detail, the process by which loan records in Voss's land trust had been altered, payment dates changed, missed payments invented, interest rates modified in the physical documents after original signing. He produced his own parallel records. He identified 6 specific cases including the Lawson loan. Percy Gill cross-examined Prout with the intensity of a man who understood that this testimony was destroying his client's case and was trying to find any hole in it. He found none. Prout had been careful and his records were thorough, and his memory of the specific alterations was specific because he had been the one asked to make them and had made his own notes because some part of him had known, even then, that this day would come. Voss sat with his face still. Gill spoke for an hour presenting the defense's position, which was essentially that the loan terms had been properly changed and that the payment history was disputed. Hooper listened to all of it with the ancient, patient attention of a man who has heard a great many arguments and has no difficulty distinguishing between the ones with foundations and the ones without. Then Judge Elias Hooper spoke. He spoke for 20 minutes. He reviewed the evidence systematically. He addressed the retroactive interest change and found it invalid under Kansas Territorial Statute. He addressed the void title claim and dismissed it permanently with the Federal Survey correction. He found that the foreclosure notice issued by Caldwell County Land and Trust was invalid, as the debt it claimed was based on improperly altered records and illegal modifications of the original loan agreement. He ruled that the Lawson Ranch, all 160 acres including the eastern parcel, remained in full legal possession of Theresa Lawson, and then he kept talking. He ordered a full investigation into the practices of Caldwell County Land and Trust to be conducted by the Circuit Court with Clark Shepard providing support and access to documentation. He noted that evidence of systemic fraud had been presented, and that this matter would be referred to the county prosecutor for consideration of criminal charges. He specifically named the cases of Roy Alderman and Dolers Crane as warranting review. The gallery was very quiet for a moment after Hooper finished. Then someone in the back began to clap, and it spread through the room with the specific, unstoppable quality of something that has been held back too long. Theresa sat very still through this. Sterling Gates shook her hand with warm, formal pleasure. She thanked him. She turned around. Clark was standing, which most of the gallery was, and he was looking at her, and the expression on his face was not triumph, which would have been too simple for what this was. It was something more like the look of a man who has seen something true confirmed, a thing he had believed from the beginning and that the world had now, for once, agreed with. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. The courtroom was loud around them with voices and movement, and the specific release of tension that sounds like weather. Theresa felt her throat tighten for the first time since the morning she had stood in the street with the foreclosure notice in her hands. She blinked twice, quickly, and pressed the feeling back down with the disciplined efficiency of long practice. Then she picked up her coat and walked out of the courtroom with her back straight and her chin up, and Clark Shepard walked beside her. On the courthouse steps, in the cold November air, they stood above the street and looked at the town. The sky was the flat, brilliant blue of a Great Plains winter, cloudless and enormous. The cottonwood trees along the street had lost their leaves, and their white trunks glowed in the cold. Main Street was ordinary and beautiful in the way of places that are entirely themselves. "I need to go home," Theresa said. "I need to see the land." "I know," Clark said. "I will ride out with you." He rode beside her wagon, not behind her, the entire 11 miles. What happened on the porch that evening was simple in the way that true things are. She brought out coffee and they sat in the cold as they had on all the other evenings. And the land around them was hers, and the silence between them was the companionable silence of two people who had been through something together and come out the other side and knew each other as a result. "What are you thinking?" she asked, which was not a question she generally asked of people, preferring to watch and deduce, but he had established himself as someone she could ask directly. "I am thinking," he said slowly, "that I have been in Caldwell County for 4 years, and in the past 2 weeks I have understood why." She was quiet, watching the last of the light leave the sky. "And I am thinking," he continued, "that I would like to stay." She turned to look at him. "In Caldwell County," he said, with a precision that was entirely intentional and that covered, with the thinnest and most transparent of veneers, everything else he was saying. "I have not been certain before now that this was where I was supposed to be." Theresa looked at him for a long moment. The stars were coming out, the big Midwestern stars that appeared in their hundreds and then their thousands as the sky darkened, the same stars she had looked at from this porch her entire life, that her mother and father had looked at, that were as much a part of this place as the soil and the creek and the cast iron pots in the kitchen. "Clark," she said. "Yes." She reached across and took his hand. Not briefly, as he had held hers on the porch step 2 weeks ago, but deliberately, completely, the way you take hold of something you have decided to keep. He turned his hand and held hers back, and they sat that way for a long time while the stars came out over the ranch that was hers, and the night settled over the land that she had refused to leave. Harlan Voss was indicted on charges of fraud and document falsification in February of 1883. The trial took place in April in the Caldwell County Courthouse, before a jury of 12 men who had read Thomas Reed's article in the Courier, and who had, several of them, neighbors and relatives among the people Voss had defrauded. Percy Gill mounted a spirited defense. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and returned a guilty verdict on 4 counts of fraud. Voss was sentenced to 3 years in the Kansas State Penitentiary at Lansing. The Chicago land development deal collapsed. The Caldwell County Land and Trust Company was dissolved by court order, and its remaining assets were liquidated, with the proceeds going first to settle the claims of defrauded landowners. Roy Alderman received compensation that allowed him to purchase a smaller piece of land and begin again. Dolores Crane received a settlement that she used, with characteristic practicality, to pay off the property she had been living in since her forced sale, securing it properly in her name. Frank Pruitt moved his family to Wichita, where he found work as a bookkeeper for a legitimate business, and rebuilt his life with the specific, quiet satisfaction of a man who had done a hard and necessary thing, and was finished carrying the weight of it. Agnes Hewitt received a formal letter of commendation from the circuit court, which she accepted with the precise dignity you would expect from Agnes Hewitt, and filed it in her own archive beside the county records she tended with such exemplary care. For Theresa Lawson, the spring of 1883 was the most specific kind of beauty, a beauty built not from the absence of difficulty, but from the fact that you had stood in the difficulty, and it had not moved you and you had come through to the other side. She planted a larger kitchen garden than her mother had ever managed, extending it along the south wall of the house until it wrapped fully around to the east. She bought 4 more head of cattle at the spring market and brought the herd up to 45. She repaired the roof of the barn with Pete and Jimmy, working alongside them in the April sun with a kind of physical pleasure that was entirely her own, the pleasure of work on land that was completely and definitively hers. Clark was there for much of it. His presence at the Lawson ranch had shifted, after the court date, from the purposeful and professional to something that was purely about wanting to be there. He continued to come every few days. He continued to sit on the porch in the evenings. He helped with the barn roof, and with the spring cattle work, and with a section of creek bank that had eroded over the winter and needed shoring up before it took out part of the pasture fence. He was, in the simplest possible terms, there. Consistently, reliably, completely. Their courtship was, by the standards of Caldwell County in 1883, not particularly conventional. It was not structured around formal calls and parlor visits and carefully supervised interactions. It was structured around the specific reality of who they both were, 2 self-sufficient people of serious temperament and quiet emotional depth, who had never been very good at doing things the way they were supposed to be done, and who had arrived at each other by a route so particular, and so their own that no conventional frame quite fit it. They talked. They read. Clark had brought, over the course of several visits, 4 of his own books to add to her shelf, with a casualness that was entirely deliberate, and that she treated with a reciprocal casualness that meant exactly what his had meant. They argued about politics, about land use, about the future of Kansas, about a novel they had both read that they disagreed about in ways that were deeply enjoyable to disagree about. They were, in the quiet daily arithmetic of shared interest and mutual regard, falling in love with a thoroughness and a completeness that made the formal progression almost beside the point. Almost. One evening in late April, when the cottonwoods along the creek were putting out their first pale green and the air smelled of new growth, and the prairie sky was doing its spring thing of being impossibly blue, Clark sat on the porch steps beside her and said, without preamble, the way he said things when he had thought about them carefully and arrived at a position he was committed to, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "I want to ask you," he said, "if you would marry me. I am asking because I love you, and because this land is yours, and I have no intention of asking you to be anything other than exactly what you are. I am asking because I want to stay here, and I want it to be because I have been asked to stay by you." Theresa was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark called from the fence line with the pristine, indifferent clarity that it had been offering the world since before either of them was born. Then she said, "Yes." It was a single word, and it was said with the directness and the total absence of performance that characterized everything she said, and it was the most complete yes Clark Shepard had ever heard in his life. He kissed her on the porch steps in the April evening with the cottonwoods and the meadowlark and the 45 head of cattle as witnesses, and she kissed him back with a warmth that he had suspected was under the composed surface, and that was, now that he was certain of it, exactly as extraordinary as he had thought it would be. They were married on the 14th of June, 1883, in the Caldwell County courthouse, which was where they had met their greatest test, and which seemed, therefore, the right place for this particular covenant. Judge Elias Hooper officiated, which he did not typically do for weddings but made an exception for because, as he said privately to Agnes Hewitt, some stories deserved to use the same room for their best chapters. Agnes Hewitt stood up as a witness for Theresa. Clark's deputy, a young man named Samuel Bright, who had been watching the whole story unfold with the admiring attention of someone who understood he was witnessing something uncommon, stood up for Clark. Pete Acre and Jimmy Calloway sat in the front row, and when Hooper said the words and the ceremony was done, Pete put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled in the way that could have been heard, and in fact was heard, from one end of Main Street to the other. The town of Caldwell County came out for the celebration that followed, which was held in the street in front of the courthouse on a long summer evening. Someone brought a fiddle and someone else brought a squeeze box, and the music was the specific, joyful music of a frontier town celebrating, which is not polished but is thoroughly and entirely real. There was food and there was dancing, and there was laughter that carried down the street and out across the flat Kansas plain in the golden light of a June evening that was, by any measure, as good as evenings get. Theresa danced with Clark on the packed dirt of Main Street in the dress she had worn to the courthouse, and she was laughing at something he had said, and he was looking at her the way he had been looking at her since October, with that full, gray, steady attention that had no performance in it at all. And the specific quality of the two of them together was something that the people of Caldwell County who saw it would remember for a long time afterward. Not because it was showy or dramatic, but because it was true, and true things have their own kind of light. They went home to the ranch that evening, Theresa and Clark, and the house that had been her mother's and then her father's and then hers was, from that night, theirs. Clark kept his position as sheriff. He would hold it for another 8 years, until he handed it to Samuel Bright in 1891. And in those 8 years, Caldwell County became the kind of place where justice was not a theoretical concept, but a practiced one, imperfect in the way all human things are imperfect but genuinely, consistently attempted. He rode his circuit from an office in town and came home to the ranch in the evenings, and the rhythm of that life, law and land in alternation, was one he found he was extremely well suited to. Theresa ran the ranch. She hired 2 additional hands the summer after the wedding, as the herd expanded and the eastern pasture was put to productive use for the first time since her father had acquired it. She was, by any accounting, an exceptional rancher, not because she was lucky, but because she understood the land in the deep, patient, intimate way of someone who has spent her entire life paying attention to it. She kept accounts with rigorous precision, and made decisions with the combination of careful analysis and confident instinct that is the mark of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. In the spring of 1884, she and Clark had their first child, a boy they named Marcus after her father. He arrived on a March morning when the prairie was just beginning to show its first green, and he was healthy and loud and had, Theresa noted with amusement, his father's gray eyes already, which was unusual and was going to be permanent. Clark held his son on the first evening of his life with the expression of a man who has been moved to a depth he did not previously know he contained, and Theresa watched him from the bed and felt something in her own chest that was so full and so particular that she held very still, as if moving might disturb it. "He is remarkable," Clark said. "He is approximately 12 hours old," Theresa said, with the dry precision that was entirely her own. "Give him time." Clark laughed, which he did more often now than he had before, and Marcus Shepard, 12 hours old and very new to the light, regarded his father with the unfocused, wide-eyed attention of someone who is still working out what he has arrived in the middle of. 2 years later, in 1886, Theresa delivered a girl they named Eleanor, after Theresa's mother. Eleanor arrived as a forceful and opinionated presence and remained one. She had her mother's dark hair and, Clark maintained, her mother's particular eyebrow, the one that said several things simultaneously. Theresa denied this and then caught herself doing the eyebrow at Clark over the breakfast table one morning, while Eleanor did it at Marcus across the same table, and had to concede the point. The ranch grew. The Lawson name remained on the land alongside Shepard, because Clark had understood from the beginning that the land's history was inseparable from the land itself, and that erasing the name would have been a kind of erasure he had no interest in. The deed read Lawson Shepard Ranch by 1885, which was Clark's own suggestion, and which Theresa accepted with a quiet gratitude she expressed not in words, but in the way she looked at him over the dinner table that evening, with the full warmth she had stopped being careful about, and that he had never taken for granted. In the summer of 1887, when Marcus was 3 and Alina was 1, and the ranch was running well, and the evenings on the porch had become the permanent daily ritual they had been promising to become since those first October nights, Clark sat beside Theresa with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand and looked out at the land in the long summer light and said, "I keep thinking about something Hooper said when I first brought him the injunction." "What did he say?" Theresa asked. "He asked if you knew what you were getting into." Clark turned to look at her. "And I told him you were the one who had come to me, that you had been preparing longer than I had." Theresa was quiet, watching the cattle move in the south pasture the same way she had watched them every evening of her life. "I have been thinking about that a lot lately," Clark said. "The fact that you already knew, the fact that you came in with the receipts and the lawyer's letter and the written account. You were already fighting before I was involved." "Yes," she said. "You did not need me to save you." "No," she agreed. "You needed someone to stand with you." She looked at him. The long summer light was gold on his face, on his gray eyes that had not changed in 5 years, that were as steady and true as the day she had walked into his office with a foreclosure notice in her pocket and no intention of being moved. "That is the thing," she said, "that most people do not understand about being strong." She paused, watching the pasture, watching the cattle move in the amber light of the evening. "It is not that you do not need anyone. It is that you need someone who meets you where you are instead of where they think you should be." Clark was quiet for a moment. Then he took her hand, the way he had that first night on this porch, completely and with full intention. "I found the right county," he said. She laughed, and it was the laugh he had been hearing for 5 years, clear and a little surprised and entirely genuine, the laugh of someone who does not laugh easily and therefore laughs true when she does. "You did," she said. In the morning of the following October, 5 years to the month after Theresa had stood in the street with a foreclosure notice in her hands, Clark rode into town early, as he often did, before the rest of Caldwell County was fully awake. The sky was the exact shade of cold blue that October in Kansas does best, and the cottonwoods along Main Street had gone yellow, their leaves turning in the early breeze with a bright, indifferent beauty. He tied his horse at the post outside the sheriff's office and stood for a moment in the quiet morning street. Down the road, the blacksmith's hammer was starting up. The smell of bread came from the bakery. A rooster called from behind the saloon. Ordinary. The word came back to him with a different weight than it had ever carried before. 5 years ago, standing outside this office, he had been a man with a job and a reputation and a practiced solitude that he had mistaken for self-sufficiency. Now he was a man with a wife and 2 children, and a ranch that bore 2 names, and a life that had taken on a weight and substance that he had not previously understood was what had been missing from it. He thought about all the mornings that had come between that October 5 years ago and this one. All the evenings on the porch, all the conversations. The court date, the wedding, the birth of Marcus and then Alina, the expansion of the herd, the books added to the shelf. The meadowlark, always the meadowlark on the fence line at the Lawson Shepard ranch, calling in the particular clear voice that was the sound signature of that specific piece of land. A man down the street, one of the early risers, turned the corner and saw him and nodded in greeting. Clark nodded back. He went inside and started the coffee. By the time the town was fully awake, Clark had his boots on the desk in the old habitual way and a fresh cup of coffee in his hand. But the difference between this morning and the morning 5 years ago, when he had sat in exactly this position reading the week-old Courier, was something that could not have been measured in any external observation. It was entirely internal, entirely earned, and entirely complete. He had ridden out to the ranch the previous evening to find Theresa on the porch with Marcus on her lap and Alina asleep in the cradle inside, and the late October light going orange across the fields, and the cattle settled in the south pasture, and the kitchen garden done for the season, but the cast iron pots still going on the stove inside, their smell coming through the window into the cooling air, rosemary and something savory. She had looked up when she heard his horse. She had smiled, A full, unhurried smile, the one she had been giving him for 5 years that still landed with the same specificity as the first one. "You are late," she had said. "I had a cattle dispute to settle," he had said. "Alderman's fence again. His east fence or his north fence? North. I told him last spring that the north fence needed replacing." "You were right," Clark had said, and sat down beside her. And Marcus had grabbed his hand immediately with the determined grip of a 3-year-old, who has decided that his father's hand is the best possible toy. And the evening had gone on around them in the specific, generous way of evenings that belong to people who have built something real. Now in his office, Clark drank his coffee and listened to the town wake up around him and thought, with a clarity that had no anxiety in it whatsoever, about going home. There was a story that got told in Caldwell County, in the years that followed, about the morning Clark Shepard had addressed the town at sunrise, standing in the middle of Main Street with the court order in his hand, and Voss's men trying one last time to move paperwork through the system in the early hours before the proceedings fully began. It was told differently by different people, as stories are, acquiring details and shading with each retelling. But the core of it, the part that stayed consistent in every version, was this. The bold sheriff stood in the street at sunrise and told the town, in the clear, steady voice that needed no elevation to be heard, that Theresa Lawson was staying in this county, and that every acre she owned was staying with her. He had said it simply, without drama, with the calm certainty of a man who had already decided and was simply informing the world of the facts. And the world of Caldwell County, standing in its doorways and on its porches in the early morning light, had listened. And what it had heard was not just a legal position or a statement of intent. What it had heard was the sound of a man who had found, in a stubborn woman with 40 books on her shelf and cast iron pots in her kitchen, and 160 acres of Kansas grassland she refused to leave, everything he had been looking for. Theresa had heard about this from Pete, who had been in town that morning. She had not said much about it. She had gone back to what she was doing, which was managing the ranch with the efficient, committed precision she brought to everything. But that evening when Clark came home, she had looked at him with those dark, steady eyes and said, "I heard you spoke for me this morning." "I spoke the truth," he said. "It happened to be about you." She had studied him for a long moment, in the way she had studied him from the beginning, fully and without pretense. "That," she said, "is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." He had laughed, and she had laughed too, and they had gone inside to the house where the coffee was on, and the children were somewhere making noise, and the cast iron pots were on the shelf, and the books were doubled on the shelves, and the land outside was theirs, both of them, all 160 acres and every ordinary, extraordinary evening it contained. The Lawson Shepard Ranch stood for another 40 years. Marcus Shepard, who had arrived in March 1884 with his father's gray eyes, grew up to be a rancher who expanded the original homestead to 230 acres and married a woman from Wichita who had her own opinions about everything, which Theresa considered an excellent sign. Eleanor Shepard became a teacher in Caldwell County, and later a school administrator, and raised 4 children of her own, and kept a reading shelf that was larger than her mother's and stocked with every bit as much intentionality. Clark Shepard served as sheriff of Caldwell County until 1891, when he handed the office to Samuel Bright and took a position on the county land board, which was rebuilding the regulation of land titles and deeds in the wake of the Voss affair, with the specific goal of making what had happened impossible to repeat. He served on that board for 12 years with the same steady, unflamboyant integrity he had brought to everything else he had ever done. Theresa Lawson Shepard ran the ranch until the year 1910, when she was 53 years old and Marcus was 26 and ready, and she stepped back from the daily management with a grace that surprised some people who knew her, and did not at all surprise the people who knew her best. She spent more time in the years that followed with her reading and her letters and her kitchen garden, which by 1910 was the most impressive private kitchen garden in the county. She also spent considerable time on the porch with Clark, in the evenings, watching the land do what land does when you give it the necessary combination of care and time, and refusal to give up on it. The meadowlark sang from the fence line, as it had always done. The cast iron pots stayed in the kitchen, as they had always done. The stars came out over the prairie every clear night, as they had since before any of them were born and would continue to do long after, enormous and indifferent and brilliant above the flat Kansas plain. And on those evenings, in the long light or in the dark, with the land around them and the house behind them and the accumulated weight of everything they had been through and built and held on to and decided to keep, Clark Shepard held his wife's hand and she held his, and neither of them would have traded a single day of the particular, difficult, extraordinary life they had made together on this particular, difficult, extraordinary piece of ground. There was nothing in the world Theresa had come to understand, like the specific gravity of staying, like choosing, in the face of everything that would move you, to remain. Not out of stubbornness, though stubbornness had its part, and not out of fear, though fear had visited like weather and been weathered like weather, and not out of any failure of imagination about what else the world might contain. She had read enough books to imagine a great many other worlds. But this one, this 160 acres of Kansas grassland with its creek and its cottonwoods and its meadowlark and its kitchen garden and its cast iron pots and its porch and its man with the gray eyes who had looked at her in her office in October 1882 and said we should talk, this one was hers, was theirs, was the specific, irreplaceable, entirely sufficient world that they had made by choosing it and fighting for it and staying. The stars came out over the Lawson Shepard Ranch on a June evening in 1910, and Theresa and Clark sat on the porch in the warm night and listened to the land breathe around them, and were, as they had been for a long time, completely and entirely home.